Good evening, everyone, esteemed panelists, our moderator, and viewers. My name is Ariane S. Richardson, and on behalf of Island Space Caribbean Museum and A Rich Culture, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion. Island Space Caribbean Museum, located in South Florida, is dedicated to the development of the Caribbean region, the advancement of its arts, culture, history, and educational initiatives. It is the only Pan Caribbean Heritage Museum in the USA, and this year, Island Space Caribbean Museum is celebrating emancipation through its programming. So today's panel is an interdisciplinary exploration of the idea of emancipation. And we welcome all of our viewers to join in the discussion by posing your questions via the platform that you're viewing on. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator. Kareem Smith is a journalist with 8 years' experience, both as a print and broadcast journalist, having worked first in the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation in Barbados before moving to the online publication Barbados Today, where he further developed his craft as a multimedia journalist covering a broad spectrum of issues. Topics covered include politics, climate change, crime, and other social issues. He has a keen interest on utilizing the reach of social media to inform and engage audiences. And while at Barbados Today, he produced and presented a number of well-received features on the media house's social media platforms. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science with Law from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, and currently he works with the communications arm of UNICEF Eastern Caribbean Area Office as a social media officer. His passions include youth advocacy, journalism, politics, and communication for development. In his spare time, Kareem enjoys sports, especially cricket, travel, and music. Thank you for being here, Kareem. And without further ado, I will let you lead.
Thank you so much, Ariane, and a warm good evening and welcome once again to Reimagining Emancipation, the Legacy of Slavery in the Caribbean Society, an Island Space Caribbean Museum, and a Rich Culture initiative. Now, this evening on our panel, a distinguished panel indeed, we have Dr. Jillian Matthews, Mr. Damion Gordon, and Dr. Delano De Souza. Dr. Jillian Matthews is a historian, researcher, and educator who holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Literature with first-class honors, a diploma in education, and a postgraduate certificate in university teaching and learning from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Dr. Matthews holds a diploma in postgraduate research and a PhD in economic and social history from the University of Hull, England, having received the university's Black Diaspora Scholarship. Her dissertation was entitled The Slave Rebellion Discourse of British Abolitionists. As a tenured lecturer in history at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, Dr. Matthews is currently engaged in the teaching of a number of courses at both the undergraduate and postgraduate level, some of which she was responsible for developing. Over the years, Dr. Matthews has supervised a number of master's and doctoral students in history and gender since 2015. Since 2015, she has served as coordinator of the MPhil and PhD programs in history at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Welcome, Dr. Matthews. Mr. Damion Gordon is a Jamaican researcher, political analyst, and lecturer of public policy management and political science in the Department of Government at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Jamaica. Mr. Gordon holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and Philosophy with first-class honors, as well as an MSc in Government with distinction from the UWI Mona campus. At present, he is an MPhil candidate who is passionate about research in areas of West Indian history, Caribbean politics, public administration, public policy analysis, digital governance, international development policy. Mr. Gordon is a senior research fellow at the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center at the UWI Mona, Jamaica, as well as a board member of the Advisory Council of the Registrar Department of Jamaica. Welcome, Mr. Gordon. And last but not least, Dr. Delano De Souza. Dr. De Souza is a finance professional and economic researcher focused on development policy analysis. He is an assistant lecturer in economics at the UWI Cave Hill campus, Barbados, and holds a Bachelor of Economics and Management and an MSc in Banking and Finance with distinction and a PhD in Economic Development Policy from the same institution. Dr. De Souza's research areas include development policy, banking, finance, and aviation, and he has previously managed in microfinance and served as a senior financial analyst in the aviation industry, where he performed financial modeling and crafting policy advice. Though a national of St. Vincent, Dr. De Souza is indeed a true regionalist, a Caribbean man who remains committed to a more integrated Caribbean region with greater opportunities for youth development and innovation. He is a Caribbean podcaster and is one half of the popular A Lawyer and a Policy Analyst Walk into a Bar podcast. This podcast raises awareness about Caribbean economic, political, legal, and social issues in a way that any citizen can understand and is available on 11 platforms globally. This evening, I invite our three panelists, first and foremost, to give a presentation all surrounding the topic of reimagining emancipation in relation to the legacy of slavery in Caribbean society. Each of the panelists will deliver a 10-minute address, followed by your questions and my questions as we delve into this most relevant topic. We will start with Dr. Jillian Matthews. Dr. Matthews, you have the floor.
Okay, I think it should be Mr. Gordon, Damion Gordon.
My apologies, Mr. Damion Gordon, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kareem. So thank you so much, Kareem, for that brief introduction. I know we're operating under time constraints, so I will get into the presentation without any delay. Now, colonialism was a project that lasted for roughly 500 years. It would have begun with the arrival of Christopher Columbus and the Spanish in 1492. The arrival of the Spanish was followed by the arrival of the British, the Dutch, and the other Europeans would have settled the Caribbean region up until around 1983, when the last Anglophone Caribbean country would have gained independence. And over the course of the colonial period, colonialism has shaped the development or the current context of the Caribbean in various ways: culturally, politically, economically, institutionally. The reality is that the essence of colonialism was hegemony. The purpose of colonialism was to establish hegemonic rule. Accordingly, the Europeans completely or attempted to completely subjugate the non-Europeans, the resources, and the territories. And they established a wide array of institutions to consolidate their hegemony when they arrived in the Caribbean. Among these institutions, they would have established a public education system, which intended to reproduce the values and the ideas of Europe that would promote the subservience of the colonized people to the Europeans. They would have introduced tax collectorate, which intended to collect, tax revenues, which for the most part were returned to the respective European countries. Importantly, they established a legal system, a public law, because what had happened was before they had arrived, there was no idea or notion of a state or a central government. The Amerindians had established their own fragmented systems of rule. They had established their own settlements along mountain ranges. And in each abuse settlement, they had established their own system of rule, etc. So there was no unitary government, there was no unitary state, there was no central state. When Europeans arrived, because they wanted to consolidate their control of the resources, the territories, and the people, they established this idea of a central government, and they established a wide array of institutions that serve different functions, interrelated functions, to consolidate their hegemony. Again, these institutions would have included a public education system, tax collectorate, a bureaucracy. And the purpose of the bureaucracy was to ensure that there were a set of procedures that would ensure that colonial administration remained predictable, orderly, and stabilized. They established a legal system as well. Importantly, they introduced a model of government. The model of government that was introduced by the Europeans was fundamentally authoritarian. It concentrated legislative and executive power in the hands of the then governor. Over time, the governor became the premier, and in our context, the equivalent of the governor back then is now the prime minister. The model of government was intentionally designed to be authoritarian. This is based on the fact that the colonizers were always fully aware that the slave population was always larger than the population of the colonizers. You know, the slave population significantly outnumbered the population of the settlers. And therefore, the colonizers were always aware that they had a numeric disadvantage relative to the slave population. They were always fearful of the slaves mobilizing their number to overthrow the colonial system. And therefore, the concentration of executive and legislative powers in the hands of the colonizers allowed the governor to be able to quickly use legislation, emergency powers, for example, to mobilize the constabulary and the army to violently or to forcefully quell or suppress any uprising. So that was a part of why the state, the mode of government established then, was fundamentally authoritarian, because the colonizers were fully aware that the slaves were greater in numbers, and therefore they had to be able to quickly mobilize the constabulary and the army to violently suppress any uprising, right? And this resulted in the executive and legislative powers being concentrated in the hands of the governor, who then, as I said, over time morphed into the premier, was over time morphed into the prime minister. So the point I'm making here is that when we think of the coercive institutions, the army and the police force, they were not established to protect necessarily the interests of the masses. They were fundamentally established to protect the interests of the state, right? So the police force, the army, were not established to defend necessarily the interests, the rights, and liberties of people. They were really established to protect state authority, to defend the state against potential uprising or any large-scale attack or aggression. So, and accordingly, we still see how that impacts how these institutions function in the Caribbean today, because the state, the prime minister still continues to exercise significant powers over the legislature. There's still a significant concentration of powers in the hands of the prime minister, and the prime minister can invoke emergency powers to suppress rights and deploy the army and the police very simply to quell any public disturbance, right? So that idea of an authoritarian state where the prime minister is able to swiftly mobilize the army and the police to quell any public disorder, that is a carryover from the colonial period, right? Again, it was linked to the idea that the slave population was always larger than the colonizers, and as such, they had to be able to position themselves to forcefully respond to any potential uprising. So that's an example of how the police and the army, in terms of how they function today, it very much similarly to how they would have functioned during the colonial period, right? So the legal system established as well. We have to talk about the legal system. It is important to note that the institutions that were established during the colonial period, they were not established to serve the interests of the colonies. They were really established to serve the interests of the colonizers, right? They were established to serve the interests of the colonizers. So the design of these systems was that these systems were designed in a particular way to ensure that the colonizers were able to fully subjugate the colonies. So it follows logically that if these institutions were established for the purpose of consolidating the hegemony of the colonizers, these institutions were therefore designed within a particular context. Insofar as the Caribbean today has moved beyond that context, the fact that we continue to still use those institutions logically mean that these institutions may very well not be serving us well, because they were not designed to serve our interests. They were designed to serve a particular set of interests within a particular time. And as such, the fact that we continue to use many of these institutions today is problematic, because again, these institutions were designed to ensure that the colonial administrators had maximum power and capacity to subjugate and control the masses, the colonies, the masses. So in terms of the legal system in the Caribbean has historically prioritized the economic interests of the elites, and this is how the legal system was designed. Obviously, colonialism was an economic project more than anything else, and the colonizers always wanted to ensure that their economic interest was always secure. And therefore, the way the legal system was designed, it was not designed to advance or to promote or protect the rights and freedom and liberties of people, because the slaves back then didn't have any notion of rights and liberties and freedoms. They were properties, and they were treated as such. And therefore, the legal system was designed first and foremost to protect property rights. So in the context of our constitutions, for example, you find that our constitution, the foundation of our legal system, promotes greater guarantee and protection of property rights than they do for human rights, because the elites, the economic elites, the planters and so forth, wanted to ensure that their assets and their properties were fully protected under law. And as such, the legal system that was established placed greater level of prioritization of the protection of property rights than it did for human rights. So even in today, contemporary Caribbean societies, and I can speak with reference to Jamaica, where I'm from, our constitution provides unconditional guarantee and protection of property rights. In other words, under no circumstance can property rights be violated. But on the other hand, human rights are not unconditionally guaranteed. In other words, the state can invoke a state of emergency and say that it is abrogating your fundamental rights because the exercise of your fundamental rights is deemed to be a threat to public order. So the state has the capacity to suspend your fundamental rights, your human rights, but under no circumstance can property rights be violated. And this is because when Caribbean states gained independence, the planters and the Europeans wanted to ensure that the wealth and the assets and the properties they had acquired before would not be taken away from them, right? They would still maintain possession and ownership of the wealth and assets and the properties that acquired prior to the independence, and as such, the clause that property rights could not be violated was a clause that was placed enshrined in the constitutions of Caribbean countries to ensure that the assets that were owned by the former colonizers were protected even after independence. And this continues to be the case today, where the constitutions of the Caribbean offer greater protection of property rights than they do for human rights, right? So we also want to touch on the matter of the Westminster Whitehall model, which is a dominant model of government across the Anglophone Caribbean. Norman Govan is an expert on Caribbean politics. He described independence making, or the process of independence making in the Caribbean, as being, it described what transpired between 1962 and 1983, when most Anglophone Caribbean countries would have gained independence. So independence, as far as it's concerned, is a product of an independence pact. What had happened was that when Caribbean countries were seeking independence from Britain, representatives of the two major political parties in most territories journeyed to Britain. They sat with British civil servants and they drafted the terms of the constitutions. And as such, the constitutions did not reflect a break from the past, did not reflect this continuity. The constitutions reflected continuity. We can compare the process of constitution making in the Anglophone Caribbean, the constitution making in Cuba, for example, or Haiti, where Haiti would have gained independence by way of revolution. Cuba would have gained independence from way of revolution, in which these countries attempted to fundamentally overhaul the existing systems. In all contexts of the Anglophone Caribbean, there was no attempt to overhaul the inherited systems. So part of the Independence Pact was that the inherited systems would not be overhauled. The inherited systems would be fundamentally retained. And as such, that is why the Westminster traditions, for example, are so deeply enshrined in the constitutions of Caribbean countries. And when I say deeply enshrined, we're talking about laws that are so difficult to change. In order for you to change deeply enshrined law, this requires a 2/3 majority in the houses of the parliament, along with a referendum. So it is difficult to change the Westminster provisions of the constitutions of Caribbean countries, because the Westminster provisions are deeply enshrined. And among the Westminster provisions, we have today the Queen, who serves as head of state. So we have a dual executive structure where executive power is divided between a Queen, who serves as head of state, locally represented by a Governor General, and a Prime Minister, who serves as head of government, which means that in effect, we still continue to recognize or cede power to a foreign authority, the Queen, who effectively was our former colonizer. The view is that it's difficult for us to consolidate or affirm our political independence when we still continue to cede or recognize or to give powers to those who are formally responsible for colonizing us. So whilst the Queen may not exercise any real power, for lack of a better word, in the context of most Caribbean countries, the Governor General who acts on behalf of the Queen is responsible for the swearing in of ministers of government, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, senators, despite the fact that the office of the Governor General is staffed and financed by taxpayers. It is, however, more accountable to the Queen than it is to the citizens of the Caribbean, because the Governor General represents the Queen. So to the average man, there is no apparent perceptible benefit of continuing to have the Queen as head of state, because the office of the Governor General is financed by taxpayers of the Caribbean, but yet the Governor General serves the Queen. To what end? This seems to be antithetical to what political independence signifies, which is an opportunity for us to affirm our own political status, to assert our own sense of sovereignty, to move beyond our past, especially a past that was so traumatic. So that's a way in which it's obvious that the retention of colonial institutions has hindered the progress of Caribbean in terms of us developing a confidence in who we are, in terms of us asserting our sovereignty as a people, affirming our own identities as a people. It's difficult to do so when we continue to hold on to these institutions that were implanted in the region by our former colonizers. So another point I want to touch on is the intermarriage of the church and the state, and that's a very important legacy of colonialism in the Caribbean. So when the Europeans came to the Caribbean, one of their objectives was to Christianize the people who they came in contact with. They saw themselves as representatives of the Catholic Church, and in the context of Britain, the Anglican Church, and therefore Christianizing the subjugated people was a very important objective and goal of the colonizers. So whatever they did, they introduced a Bible, they introduced religious education, and the legal system was also based on religion. You know, the idea was that the law of the land was subservient to the law of God, or divine law, and therefore the legal system in the Caribbean is significantly modeled off Christian-based moral codes. The implication of this is that for non-Christian Caribbean nationals, there is no full recognition of the cultural and religious rights of non-Christians, because the laws are fundamentally modeled off Christian values, Christian moral codes. So if you're a Muslim, for example, you may believe in the idea of having multiple wives. The constitutions, I'm not sure, maybe Trinidad and Guyana may offer some, you know, more protection than other Caribbean states, but non-Christian groups are not fully able to assert their religious and their cultural rights, because the laws are fundamentally modeled off Christian values and Christian moral codes. So for example, in Jamaica, you're not allowed to have multiple wives. While this may be fine with somebody who identifies as a Christian, if you're a Muslim Jamaican and you want to exercise your right to have multiple wives, you're unable to do so, because the laws are fundamentally based on Christian values and Christian moral codes. Because again, Europeans had established this pattern of the intermarriage of the state and the church, and the legal system was fundamentally modeled off, you know, the divine laws or Christianity. And this has presented current implications for how non-Christian groups in the Caribbean are able to assert their cultural and their religious rights. I'm not sure if I still have some time. Do I still have some time? I suspect that I've been talking for a while. Do I still have some time, moderator?
Well, we can get back to it in the question and answer segment for sure, because you've given us quite a bit of food for thought. And we can tell that you are extremely passionate about impact of colonialism on our legal system and our legal norms, etc. But at this time, I'm going to move on to Dr. De Souza. Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon. We're going to move on to Dr. De Souza, and he is going to unpack for us the topic moving past colonialism's role in the economic development of the region post-emancipation, along with the implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative on our economic development. Dr. De Souza? I'm sorry, you're muted, Dr. De Souza.
My apologies. Thank you, Kareem, and thank you for having me, and pleasant good evening to everybody who's listening and tuned in to the session. We were indeed given a lot to chew on by the presenter who preceded me, and it sort of helps me in some ways to move more directly into some of the issues with respect to the specific questions that I've been asked to delve into this evening. So, like Kareem would have said, I've been tasked with speaking about moving past colonialism's role and speaking about economic development in the region post-emancipation. I've also been asked to tackle the China's Belt and Road Initiative, so I'm going to speak about that after this bit about moving past colonialism. Now, it's very important, and I like the fact that I came after my colleague, because it allows me then to move directly. So, how do we move past colonialism and achieve economic development? Because truly that's what we're asking ourselves. How are we going to move past this particular, this phase, this particular period in our time that so much has been spoken about, so much has been written about, and the impacts continue to be felt to this day? It's a very difficult and complex question, as you know, and it's very difficult to answer, especially in the context of the fact that history of slavery and the legacy which it has left us with in terms of the state of underdevelopment in the region. Now, what is this legacy of underdevelopment that I'm speaking about that has come from slavery? Now, historically, as we know, we largely lack the tools required to engineer our development. And this is really consequential upon the history of colonialism and slavery. Now, if you think about the way our Caribbean has developed, and if you can almost think about every facet of our development in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our healthcare system, all of the above, you really can see that the legacy of slavery has sort of held us back. Now, Professor Hilary Beckles recently penned a new book in terms of how Britain would have underdeveloped the Caribbean and so on. We are familiar with how Europe has underdeveloped Africa, very influential pieces of literature. Yeah. And so if we want to move forward, we have to speak about this, and we have to talk about how we are going to move past and how we're going to engineer our own development. Now, I've mentioned education as an important pillar. Infrastructure is another important pillar. And when I speak about infrastructure, I'm speaking about not just physical, I'm also talking about capital, access to capital and health. Now, for 400 years, the trade and production policies of Europe could really be summed up in the British slogan, "Not a nail is to be made in the colonies." And this is coming from the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. And this really is the truth, because the way that Europe operated in terms of slavery and in terms of the colonial system is that the aim of it was really extraction, as we know, and not just extraction in terms of the crops and in terms of the wealth, but they made it, or they engineered the system in such a way to ensure that there was a legacy of underdevelopment. They ensured that our people lacked the ability really and the infrastructure and what was required to move past and to develop on their own. And they engineered it in such a way that nothing was to be built, no infrastructure was to be built up. I know in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I always speak about this, when we achieved independence in 1979, it was interesting to note that we really only had 2 schools in St. Vincent, and the 2 schools that we had, really, the 2 main schools, that they were largely dilapidated. They lacked, there was no significant education infrastructure. If you look in terms of manufacturing and so on, if you look across the region, that really was our legacy. In addition to a lack of infrastructure, we also have a health crisis. Now, the African descended population in the Caribbean has the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases in the form of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. And this, of course, has been traced back to our legacy of slavery. And because of that, that has created a health crisis today that continues to occupy the minds of our politicians, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of resources. So we continue to spend a significant amount of our resources trying to stem or trying to pull back, sort of repair the damage done in terms of the health of our people. That is another area in terms of the legacy of underdevelopment. Indebtedness is another area that we cannot ignore as well. Some countries in the Caribbean are amongst the highest indebted in the world. And I mean, this has generally been as a consequence of borrowing, really, in an effort again to move forward and to move past the hundreds of years of wealth extraction from the region. Now, as we gained our independence, and the previous speaker would have spoken about how we've moved from the premier to the prime minister and the Westminster system and how we've developed. But what we cannot fail to recognize is that in order to fund this push towards self-sufficiency, this push towards our own development, we've had to borrow. It has come at a tremendous cost. And the irony is that we've been borrowing from the very people, from the very countries that have caused us to be in this position. Yeah. So we are borrowing extensively from countries in Europe, and so the Paris Club and all these international lending agencies. And what we are now realizing is that the countries in the Caribbean lack the ability to really repay this debt in a meaningful way. And as we grapple with other challenges, again, a lot of them are as a consequence of our history. As we grapple with those other challenges, it sort of exacerbates our position fiscally, and we are unable to really move past and to really develop. So that history of indebtedness is something that we must address. Yeah. So how do we move forward in terms of development? And I'm just throwing out some broad ideas in anticipation of the discussion and the question and answer segment that is to come. How do we move forward? And I see really 4 important areas that we need in order to move forward and to move past, in some ways, this history of colonialization. And so the first one I would say is regional integration. As many of you will know, anybody who follows my work and my writings, you would know I'm a regional integration proponent, and I speak about it heavily. But I believe truly that the way that the Caribbean can move forward is by coming closer together in order to sort of surmount a lot of these problems and these legacies of slavery that we have in common. We talk about the role of CARICOM. We speak about coming together in terms of our economic might, in terms of a global voice, in terms of even access to resources, in terms of capital, in terms of movement of people, in terms of employment, in terms of empowerment of our people. And regional integration is one of the pillars there. If we talk about transportation, we talk about reducing our dependence on foreign goods in terms of our import bills and all of that. Regional integration is something that is core. It's a common thread that runs through a lot of those ideas in terms of how we move forward. And sort of piggybacking from what the previous speaker would have said, political reform is also important. Political reform, not just of the Westminster system, but in terms of individual political parties as well, because we have to recognize that the constitutions of the DLP or the BLP or the St. Vincent Labour Party or the Dominican Labour Party, all of these parties, or the People's Progressive Party, all of these parties have internal structures and constitutions which really foment to then interact on the national scale. So, for example, if it's difficult for young people to be able to advance in the context of the party itself, how are we going to have leaders being fed through on a national scale? If we have a situation in the political parties where our political leaders serve for 30 and 40 years, how then can we move forward, and how then can we bring some fresh blood into it? So I believe that we not just in terms of reform of the Westminster system, but also in terms of political reform, deeper political reform that goes down to its core, that embraces the youth and new sort of paradigms in terms of thinking for development. And I think that's critical as well. Thirdly, I believe investment in education and social welfare is important. We've seen, and one thing I always say, education is always the way in terms of empowering our people, in terms of stemming a lot of the social ills, in terms of empowering our people to move forward economically. All of those are important facets that flow from investment in education. We've seen it in some parts of the world. We've seen it in places like Cuba, and where they have among the lowest illiteracy rate in the world and all those. And that's from really the investment in education and social welfare. We have to take care of the most vulnerable among us. And those are important elements, I believe, that can help us in terms of our development. Because, of course, when you speak about education, you're speaking about the ability to earn, the ability to help your society, the ability to give back, the ability to advance, the ability to create new industries within the country, the ability to earn foreign exchange. All of that stems from education. And I'm not just speaking about formal education, I'm speaking about other aspects as well, which I won't get into now. Fourth, and my final one in terms of how we move forward, I think modernization of the financial system is quite important. And not just modernization, but I dare say reform in some aspects as well. Because if we talk about access to capital, that's an important one. Reform of the banks in terms of their lending practices and the fees and so on. So those are the four main ones that I want to just tease out now in terms of how we move forward. Now, I just want to switch gears quickly and speak about China's Belton Road Initiative and the possible implications for economic development. Now, in preparation for this space, I really spent some time delving into the Belton Road Initiative. And with that, I found a very interesting study, which I'm going to speak to in a bit. Now, what is the Belton Road Initiative? Now, in September 2013, President Xi called for the establishment of a new regional cooperation model by jointly building the Silk Road economic belt, and this later morphed into what we know today as the Belton Road Initiative. Now, what it is, it's really a push for China to strengthen its global connectivity. It's a long-term infrastructure development scheme and a major component of Beijing's foreign policy agenda. Now, some persons might be asking, how is it a long-term development scheme and we're still speaking about foreign policy, and we're speaking about foreign policy agenda in the same breath? But we also know that economic power is really a foreign policy in another form. So while building on the memories of in terms of what we've seen in terms of the investment, we saw that China increased its investment globally significantly over the last 12 years or so. Now, and that's important. So in 2019, in terms of the inward foreign direct investment different regions, we'll recognize in terms of the Latin America and the Caribbean, you'll recognize that some 20% was coming in terms of foreign direct investment was coming from, in 2019 was coming from the US, Asia 31%, and a lot of that, significant amount of that was coming from China, Europe 30%. And if you look at the movement or the growth in terms of China's outward FDI flows, you'd recognize that it has coincided with the Belt and Road Initiative and how much money they've been pumping into this initiative globally. Now, why are we speaking about the Belt and Road Initiative? I think that's important for us to kind of unpack as well, because it has implications. When we speak about the Belt and Road Initiatives, we've heard all these sort of anecdotal stories. Some of them are really just stories about the indebtedness of some countries and how it's impacted how China has come in and taken over infrastructure after default of loans and so on. But I think what we cannot miss in this as well is that we must speak about the power. We must speak about the hegemony in terms of how a lot of these global superpowers work, and the fact that peddling economic influence is quite important to the foreign policy agenda. In terms of the Caribbean, specifically with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, you'd recognize that there are many Caribbean countries that have been a part of this. So we could mention Jamaica, where several roads and so on have been built in Jamaica. Barbados is a Belt and Road Initiative partner as well. Dominica, Grenada, Guyana in particular now, with their boom in terms of oil and gas, they've seen a lot of partnership and a lot of infrastructure loans and so on under the Belt and Road Initiative being used to develop Guyana. And that's important. We see it in Suriname as well, Trinidad and Tobago, Cuba, Venezuela. These are some of the major ones in terms of what we see. The Dominican Republic is another big player in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Dominican Republic, one of the biggest projects, has negotiated a $600 million loan to upgrade power distribution in the country. And this is coming from the China Import-Export Bank. And when you speak about the Belt and Road Initiative, you often see entities like the China Export-Import Bank, different Chinese entities that are affiliated with the state that are really pushing finances and resources in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, quickly, as I wind down, so implications on economic development. You recognize for us, the Belt and Road Initiative has the potential to feed into a lot of needed infrastructural development. I spoke about roads. I spoke about there's the electrical dam in Guyana. There's the upgrades to the electricity network in the Dominican Republic, and several other initiatives that are being done that stand to benefit the Caribbean in terms of infrastructure development, needed infrastructure development, and which we would otherwise struggle to finance if we're being honest. Now, in terms of the political, I think this is perhaps the one that is discussed the most in terms of, this Belt and Road Initiative is really waking up a lot of the other Western powers. So countries like the US and the UK, they are alive to the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative is earning China a lot of favor in the region and the world, really. And, it's really their intention to sort of stem the influence of China. And so what we've seen now is almost a response. If you note recently, the US and Canada has put forward a significant aid package and so on towards the Caribbean and so on. There's sort of a small realignment in terms of how that's operating as well. But just to wind down and just to finish, I just want to mention this study by Hurley et al. And it's really examining the debt implications of the Belt and Road Initiative from a policy perspective. Now, this is a very interesting paper, and I recommend that if you have the time that you read it. But it surveyed 68 countries that are under the Belt and Road Initiative, that have received funds under the Belt and Road Initiative. And the aim of the paper was really to ascertain if this Belt and Road Initiative is exacerbating the debt situation of these countries. And what the paper found, interestingly, is that only 8 of the countries, and this is a 2021 paper, that only 8 of the countries that were surveyed their debt situation is likely to be exacerbated as a consequence of the receipt of Belt and Road funds and the relationship with China. And that's important. A lot of these countries, they are Djibouti, Laos, Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, and so Pakistan. These are among the 8. And really, what this means is that, by and large, the Belt and Road Initiative is not necessarily exacerbating debt. We've also had some situations, and the paper also explored how China has dealt and managed in instances where these countries have defaulted. So we know that in Sri Lanka, after the $8 billion loan was defaulted on. China agreed in July 2017 to a debt for equity swap on a 99-year lease for the port, which was constructed. All of these are really some of the concerns that people have in terms of the Belton Road Initiative. But it's really interesting, and I hope that we can unpack a little bit about it as we go forward. I'm sorry for going over my time. My apologies, moderator.
Absolutely no problem, Dr. De Souza. Thank you so much for that presentation. Once again, quite a bit of passion as we unpack some of the challenges that we face as a region. I'm not sure, I don't think that we have been joined by Dr. Matthews as yet. So I think we're going to head straight into the question and answer segment. And I want to start with Mr. Gordon. I just want to backtrack to our discussion on the legal system. And I want our panelists to feel free. Dr. De Souza, do not limit yourself only to a discussion on economics. And Mr. Gordon, please feel free to jump in on the economic side of things, because as you know, many of these issues are very much interlinked.
Yes.
So, Mr. Gordon, you spoke about the legal system. You spoke about us being steeped in dependency on an old model of colonialism, a colonial legal system, etc. What I wanted to hear from you, though, would be some of the solutions. I know there's been a discussion that pops up and dies down in the region about republicanism.
Yes.
To what extent, in your view, does this particular discussion solve many of the problems that we see with regard to our legal system in the Caribbean, our legal systems in the Caribbean?
Yeah, so certainly the discussion about constitutional reform has been on the public and the agenda in the Caribbean since the 1970s. We've been having ongoing discussions about constitutional reform. Some Caribbean states have taken the lead and have undertaken significant reforms of their constitutions. Guyana, for example. Guyana inherited Westminster similar to other Caribbean countries, Anglophone Caribbean countries, and immediately following its independence, Guyana abandoned that system for a system that was customized to serve the interests of the independent Guyanese states. So today, the Guyana uses a hybrid system. They don't have a dual executive structure. They have a president who is both the head of state and the head of government. So Guyana no longer swears allegiance to a foreign power, as is the case with many other Anglophone Caribbean countries. So we want to look at independence as not just, I think independence should also be psychological. It should have many facets. The process of independence should have many facets. And psychologically, it does something to us when we still feel that we are intellectually inferior. In other words, we have to use ideas and systems and procedures and institutions that were developed by our colonizers. So part of us developing confidence in our identities, and it's a part of getting rid of this inferiority complex that colonialism has left behind in the region is for us to develop confidence in our own systems, our own capacities, our own people, our own intellectualism, and moving away from the colonial institutions is an important part of this process of shaping confidence in our own people, our own systems, our own intellectualism, our own capacities, right? So another important element of constitutional reform has to do with the Privy Council. Currently, as it stands, the Privy Council is still the final court of appeal for many Anglophone Caribbean countries, even though most CARICOM countries would have ratified, or would have agreed in principle to accept the CCJ as a final court of appeal via the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. To date, only 4 Caribbean countries have followed suit. The implication of this for Caribbean nationals is that for those Caribbean nationals who want to appeal the verdicts or the judgments, many of them may lack the means and the resources to take their cases to the Privy Council, and that ultimately amounts in many contexts to a miscarriage of justice because it's very expensive to access a Privy Council. I think the average cost to access a Privy Council is 120,000 US, which is pretty exorbitant for the average Caribbean national. I mean, justice is the most important principle of a free and democratic society. And if average citizens are unable to appeal judgments, which they may very well think are unfair or may not be, they want to appeal judgment, which is their right, they may decide against it because they may very well feel that the Privy Council is out of their reach, it's inaccessible. And again, that amounts in many contexts of violation to a miscarriage of justice. The reality is that since independence, the Caribbean has come a far way in terms of our educational attainment levels. We have professionals in law, in medicine, and all fields that are among the best in the world, which means that we very well have the intellectual capacity, the human resources to administer our own political, legal, and judicial processes, right? There's no question about the quality and the competence of our judges or lawyers or economists, right? We have produced some of the finest among the world. There's really no rational basis for us to have our appellate court, for example, based in the UK, which is out of the immediate reach of most Caribbean nationals. And therefore, if somebody wants to appeal a case, they may decide against it because they may very well not be able to access the Privy Council because of the exorbitant economic and other costs associated with that. Again, that undermines the fabric of democracy. You know, the ability to be able to access justice, you know, is a fundamental principle of democracy, and the fact that is something that undermines our democracy to a great extent. Again, I noted that in the current context of the constitutions offer greater protection of property rights than they do for human rights. And this has to do with the influence of the Europeans in terms of the drafting of the constitutions. Because the constitutions of the Caribbean were negotiated. They were not, you know, revolutionary documents which certain British civil servants, and the terms of the constitutions are favorable. They're favorable to the retention of British influence over the Caribbean. And therefore, part of retaining the British influence over the Caribbean was recognizing that prior to independence, the British would have acquired tremendous assets and wealth over the period of colonialism. They didn't want those assets and wealth to be confiscated by the independent state. So what they did was that they ensured that they were able to consolidate all those assets and wealth that they owned before. That is why the structure of ownership in the Caribbean today is so unequal, where the descendants of the slaves barely own anything.
Yeah.
While the descendants of the colonizers, they own the wealth and the assets of the region. And a part of the independence constitution should have ensured that there was a transfer of the balance of power and ownership from the few to the many.
Okay, let me just interject here now, and I really want to get Dr. De Souza's take on this. But before I do that, one of the things for me personally, when I was practicing journalism late last year, when Barbados transitioned to a republic, one of the questions that the average person on the street would ask is, what is in it for me? What is in it for our society? And I definitely hear you on the CCJ, and I do also hear you on the need for us to elevate our thinking and to be able to develop a certain confidence in our ability to govern our own affairs. I understand. But what we have in many of the countries in our region, within those constitutions, is the need for things like a referendum to make changes like that. And again, it always takes you back to the question, what's in it for a young man in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Why would he vote for something like that? And what differences can we see in countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Dominica, Guyana, for instance, or even Barbados, because of the change that they made that we don't now see in St. Vincent and the Grenadines or in Antigua and Barbuda? How have Republican states in the Caribbean been able to distinguish themselves in a way that our constitutional monarchies have done?
I think the benefit of it is that we expect our political leaders to recognize the trauma of colonialism and of slavery, which I noted is a 500-year product. And it would have done immense psychological, economic, physical damage to the people of the region, the landscape, the developmental prospects of the Caribbean. So when we have leaders who understand that transformation is not only physical, because Caribbean people have suffered from low self-esteem, they've suffered from inferiority complexes. And a part of us developing our own institutions is to send a message that we can do things on our own. We can move away from the colonial vestiges. I think when we incrementally, it's not just a one thing. It's about making these incremental changes, understanding the needs, the necessities of the people of the region, understanding the elements of the political system that we have inherited that don't work, that have not served our interests. So it's about showing that you're thinking about the needs of your people and you're willing to make the changes that will lead to a better system, one that is more representative, and one that will help people to build confidence in themselves, and one which will reduce the sense of our subservience and our need to continue to hold on to that of the past that really doesn't serve us. So again, I don't presume that just moving away or replacing the Queen as head of state will solve all our issues, but it's about leadership, right? And I think this sends a message that we have a political directorate that understands our past and understands the importance of incrementally establishing ways of governing ourselves that are based on the needs or that respond to the needs of the people of the region.
Understood.
Right? I want to get lazy for us to just inherit systems and continue to use them as they existed or they were used before. We have to reshape our future. And expect the leadership to lead that charge. All right.
Thank you so much. I want to get Dr. De Souza's take on this. During his presentation, he did mention the need for political reform as part of the roadmap towards economic development. Unpack that for me. What does it mean? Does it include, as far as the whole discussion on republicanism? How does reform of our political institutions beyond the political party, etc., equal economic development?
Well, yeah, thanks for that, Kareem. And I think leadership is really the core element of it here. Now, it's not just about moving away from the Queen or from the monarchy and becoming a republic. That's all well and good. And I believe that our people deserve that. I believe our leadership should be focusing on moving in that direction. All well and good. But I believe in terms of the political reform, it cannot just be, as Barbados is currently doing now, it cannot just be that we've moved to Republican status and we're not reforming other elements of the Constitution, that we're not undergoing a sort of inward dissection and a look at ourselves in terms of how we want to be, either as Barbadians, Vincentians, Dominicans, what have you. So yes, that is an important element of it, but I think also we have to go beyond that. It has to be, like I said, constitutional reform. We have to move towards the CCJ. We have to move towards something as simple as how we elect the Speaker of the House in different countries. We have to look at things such as the constitution of our Senate and whether or not we have a unicameral or bicameral system, that sort of thing. And that's important. Why is that important to economic development? Because a lot of the challenges that we have in the region, and I mean the IMF, the World Bank, and so several papers have been written and published about the fact that corruption and inefficiencies within small states have sort of stymied our progress. We look across the region now. We have prime ministers that have been in office for 20 years. We look across the region now. We have political parties that are so entrenched that there's really no voice for a third party system. There's no voice for dissent in many respects. What I found interesting, and it's sort of ironic. I was doing a paper on Angola the other day, and what I realized that Angola did, and some of the other territories have done it as well, is that they have a system now where they, in addition to having constituencies, they now have island-wide constituencies. So they're the constituencies that are broken up in terms of the 50, 32, how much ever, but then they're island-wide constituencies where the entirety of the population or the entirety of the electorate vote for those persons, and then they then go into parliament to be island-wide representatives, which I found interesting. But what it allowed for, I think it was at least 15, 20 persons to go in, almost like a presidential election in some way, except you're not getting the presidency, you're getting a seat as an MP. And that's, and I say it's ironic because, of course, we know that Angola is still a territory of the UK. And so, but the point I'm making is that insofar as we're able to develop and to reform our systems, we're in a position to at least diminish corruption. Persons and parties being in power for 20 years is not good for us, and I say that unequivocally. We might go in the direction of invoking term limits and that sort of thing. That helps there in terms of the corruption. It helps in terms of putting things in place. We need things in terms of reform as well, in terms of managing our debt, whether it be fiscal responsibility legislation, and all those things really stem from a responsible political directorate. And where we are now in terms of the Westminster system, it's difficult to get there. We have prime ministers, we have political parties that have been speaking about freedom of information legislation and several other important pieces of reform that we've yet to see come to fruition in the region. And I believe that economic and constitutional reform is the way to get us to a better system of governance that can really lead the charge towards economic development, responsible borrowing, managing our debt levels, that sort of thing. That's how we move forward in terms of our economic development.
Thank you so much, Delano. And just in, Dr. Jillian Matthews, lecturer in history. Thank you so much for joining us. We have been discussing the impact, the legacy of colonialism and its impact on our region, the Caribbean region. And we've been dissecting that from the perspective of the legal system, our economic systems, the legacy of underdevelopment and dependency. And we've been looking at some solutions that are homegrown, things about our countries and our regions, our islands and our nations, ways that we can improve the situation. We've invited you to speak on reparations. We want you to discuss it a bit more briefly, perhaps, than you would have in about 5 minutes, to just summarize how the discussion on reparations is intertwined in this entire discussion.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I tried to get on earlier. I've been waiting since 5:30, but finally I'm here, and I'm very thankful to be able to offer some quick thoughts on this discussion. As previously noted, I'll be looking at the Caribbean reparation movement and British slavery apologies. The subject matter of the paper is the apology theme of the Caribbean reparation movement, focusing particularly on the way in which different voices in the United Kingdom have offered different apologies as a result of their involvement in slavery. Briefly looking at the period from about 1999 to the present 2022. The paper is located within the Caribbean Reparation Commission, which was established in 2013 to put forward a legal and a moral case calling upon former European colonizers to apologize for their role in slavery. In terms of the historiography on reparations, it's a new and expanding area, including some examples such as Boris Bitker's The Case for Reparation, which was published in 1972. Nora Rittman's Slavery Reparation Time Is Now, published in 2015. 2013, and the flagship publication of this subject matter is Hilary Beckel's Britain's Black Debt, published in 2013. Few writers, however, have focused on the apology dimension of the Caribbean reparation movement. Consequently, the aim of this presentation is to delineate as quickly as I can and analyze the United Kingdom-based slavery apologies to determine the extent to which, if at all, they align to the Caribbean reparation campaign. The first city in the United Kingdom to offer an apology for slavery was Liverpool, and this was done on December the 9th, 1999. And the apology read, "We apologize to the millions of African sons and daughters kidnapped directly from the continent who suffered profound physical and mental abuse." This apology was accompanied by magnanimous respect for the Black presence and contributions, both past and present, in the city of Liverpool. For example, in 1999, Liverpool led the way in the United Kingdom in observing August the 23rd as the International Day for the remembrance of the abolition of the slave trade. In 2004, it began following the example of the USA observing Black History Month. In 2007, it inaugurated the high-profile Slavery Remembrance Memorial Lecture. In 2017, it spent large sums of money to establish the International Slavery Museum. In 2010, it collaborated with the Liverpool University to launch the Center for the Study of International Slavery. These initiatives were all varied and significant and certainly made the 1999 apology quite meaningful. However, its obvious drawback was that it was an apology not from the national government, which is what the Caribbean Reparation Justice Program requires, but an apology from a repentant city. Then the Church of England in 2006 also apologized, made a statement about the church's involvement in slavery. However, this did not, as in the case of Liverpool, translate into any tangible development that pushed forward the reparation movement. As a matter of fact, the church remains today the only UK entity that has entertained the possibility of paying financial reparation. However, they stalled on that promise by presenting the lame excuse that it is difficult to determine the format and the beneficiary of financial reparation. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain in 2006, also offered, and this time on behalf of the British government, an apology in 2006 stating, "I believe the bicentenary," and here he was referring to the 200th-year anniversary of the British abolition of the trading captive Africans, which was celebrated in a big way in the United Kingdom in 2007. So he said that the bicentenary offers us a chance, not just to say how profoundly shameful the trade was and praise those who fought for its abolition, but also to express our deep sorrow that it would have ever happened. Blair's critics rejected this expression of sorrow, insisting that it was barely an apology. It was more of a mumble jumble and a mealy-mouthed apology. Una King, who was the Baroness in the House of Lords at the time, shed light on Blair's statement of sorrow about slavery by noting, "The Prime Minister is stopping short of a full apology because it leaves the state open to claims for reparation," clearly indicating that Britain is unwilling to make a full and formal apology for its role in the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. There were two other apologies. I won't go into much detail because of time. One from Peter Hayne, who was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and Wales, and the second was from the former Mayor of London, Kenneth Livingstone. The former, the one from Peter Hayne, did not translate into much action and created quite a stir from the Irish people who rejected the need for the apology, since they insisted, although history proved them dishonest, that they had no participation in the transatlantic slave trade. And Livingstone's apology was also did not have any tangible consequences, but it did advance the intellectual dimension of the Caribbean reparation movement, because he presented three solid counter-arguments to persons who have taken a negative position towards the reparation movement. And I just mentioned those three counterpoints that he raised which support reparation very quickly. One, he noticed that distance in time could never erase the memory of mass murder that enslavement caused. Secondly, he noticed that refusal to apologize would lower England in the eyes of the world. And finally, that reparation, and this is a very strong point, a point that Hilary Beckles also repeats, that reparation is legitimized by the fact that Londoners today, as a matter of fact, the whole of the United Kingdom, are enjoying massive profits which slavery generated. The last two apologies or statements about slavery coming from the United Kingdom were quite recent, in 2021 and 2022, during their respective visits to the Caribbean to mark, first of all, Republican rule in Barbados and to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. Prince Charles and his son Prince William spoke regrettably about the appalling atrocity of slavery which forever stains our history. And William added, quote, "I want to express my profound sorrow," just like what Prime Minister Blair had said earlier in 2006, "I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent and it should never have happened." The royal pair were both severely criticized in Jamaica, in Barbados, in the Bahamas, as well as in Antigua. As a matter of fact, their limited statements in terms of giving an apology for the United Kingdom's involvement in slavery in the Caribbean have led groups like Advocate Network in Jamaica to say to Prince William, just say you're sorry. Just say you are sorry. I conclude by noting the following. British slavery statements with regards to apologizing or acknowledging their involvement have fallen far short of what the Caribbean Reparation Commission now requires. They have admitted guilt, but have not offered the explicit, full, formal, and sincere apology that the 2014 Caribbean Reparation Justice Program demands. Except perhaps for Liverpool City, the attempt to apologize reflect the miserliness, the superficiality, the disregard, and sometimes even hypocrisy, but mainly the disregard for the descendants of people of Africa who were enslaved in the Caribbean region. Nevertheless, they are strong indicators that the United Kingdom is fully cognizant of its wrongdoing and of the heavy debt that it owes in terms of repairing the devastating legacy of slavery in the Caribbean. I'll rest it there and look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. Very comprehensive presentation in a very short space of time. And I see immediately a question pops up. what does reparations look like to you? And it's one of the questions that I have, and I think one of the questions that many of us in the Caribbean grapple with. Discussions like, who is to benefit, who would determine who benefits from economic reparations, who will be paid, how much, from where. How do we resolve those types of questions? And I understand, I hear you for sure when we discuss the need for many of these institutions, governments, entities to first apologize and acknowledge the extent to which the Caribbean and Caribbean people were harmed by this process. But when we get past that, what does it look like?
Right. So I think for most people, they are expecting when they hear the word reparation, pay. As a matter of fact, I had presented a YouTube for Let's Talk History. And at the end of the presentation, one member of the audience said, cut my check right now. But when we look at the 10-point plan devised in 2014 by Hilary Beckles and his colleagues, there is not even a direct statement asking for money. They are asking instead, yes, for the apology. And of course, the apology doesn't stop there. After the apology, what next? Some of the initiatives that Hilary Beckles, who is the president, or the chair rather, of the Caribbean Reparation Committee, are calling for medical programs to deal with diseases which can be traced right back to slavery. They are also calling for scholarships for the development of museums in the Caribbean. There are quite a number in the United Kingdom today, as I mentioned, the one in Liverpool, and there is also one in Hull. But we want museums in the Caribbean sponsored by Europeans, teaching our Caribbean people about what happened during slavery, what is the legacy of slavery, so that our Caribbean people do not necessarily have to travel to Europe to find out the truth about the enslavement experience. The 10-point plan also calls for programs to develop First Peoples. I mean, at the forefront of the program is reparation for slavery, but First Peoples have also been affected. They suffered genocide at the hands of the colonization by the Europeans. Another big item on the 10-point plan is debt forgiveness. So what we are seeing is that Hilary Beckles and the CARICOM Reparation Commission have given much insightful thought about the forms that reparation can take. It does not exclude money altogether, but it's more than just giving us some money to spend to say, okay, this is the payment for 300 or 400 years of uncompensated labor. Europe has developed as a result of exploiting the Caribbean. In reparation, we are calling on Europe to pump resources, pump technology, medical knowledge, and so on into the Caribbean to assist in Caribbean development from a social dimension, from an educational dimension, and not just limiting it to a financial situation.
Thank you so much for that. I want to give Dr. De Souza the floor, because during his presentation, there were some issues that he identified that would have felt, it would have felt to me as though they were lock in step with some of the issues identified in that 10-point plan, issues like the health crisis, in heavy indebtedness in the region. Dr. De Souza, what role, in your view, does reparatory justice play in terms of repairing the issues that you identified in our region?
Well, I think it has tremendous potential to address a lot of the issues that I raised. So we spoke about the health crisis, and in terms of the diabetes, in terms of the struggle that we have with our people, in terms of being able to really pull together a healthcare system that is effective and that does not drain too much of our resources. And that's a challenge that we have now. I mean, COVID-19 basically brought us to our knees because while we were speaking about that pandemic, a lot of persons forgot about the ongoing pandemic in relation to non-communicable diseases in the region and how much money our governments continue to pump into that. So in terms of the 10-point plan, addressing the health crisis in the region is quite important because it gives us the opportunity to sort of realize that, you know, this reparatory justice can help us in many ways. So yes, health is an important part. Debt forgiveness is another big part of the 10-point plan. I think that's number 10, if my memory serves me correctly. I spoke about just how much debt we've accumulated over time, and not just because we wanted to borrow. We've borrowed in the way that we've borrowed in many respects because we were forced to sort of confront the legacy of slavery and colonialism and trying to bring our people forward and trying to do so in the quickest amount of time. And in order to do so, we've had to borrow. And like I said in my presentation, the irony is that we're borrowing from the same persons who have extracted from us. If you think about the Paris Club, you think about those lending consortiums, and so a lot of it some people might say it's our money that they're now giving back to us in aid, that they're now giving back to us in the form of loans, and so the CARICOM Reparative Commission is really asking for us to, you know, for us to be forgiven. We've seen, and it's interesting because we look at debt forgiveness in the context of the Caribbean. Venezuela recently, if I remember correctly in terms of the figure, something like $79 million or something that they forgave for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Venezuela, with all its struggles, is able to do those sort of things in terms of solidarity and helping St. Vincent and the Grenadines to move forward. But yet we have these former colonizers who are unwilling to make steps like that. Another element in terms of the 10-point plan is the eradication of illiteracy. And that ties into the whole notion of investment in education. And that's also another reason why we're so indebted. If you think about the enormous sums of money we've borrowed to develop our school system and our education system across the region, all of that ties back in. And if we want to move forward to remove and to get rid of this illiteracy that we have in the Caribbean and the legacy that has come from slavery, we have to move in that direction. The long and short of it is this 10-point plan, if we're able to achieve or if we're able to make some progress on this, it stands to benefit the region significantly. And Dr. Matthews would have alluded to the fact that, you know, CARICOM did not put a dollar value, or they did not say, you know, it's monetary only, but they've done so strategically in recognition in terms of the sort of challenges that we face in terms of reparatory justice. And just finally, in terms of how we can move forward from an economic standpoint, I spoke about the lack of infrastructure. Technology transfer, if I remember correctly, is another one of the 10-point plan in terms of being able to develop you know, our technologies in the region, our infrastructure, our IT, in order to move our people forward. And that's another part of the 10-point plan that can help propel us. So in short, there's a lot of potential there if only we could convince, we could get, you know, the former colonizers to make some progress and to take some bold steps on reparatory justice.
Okay. I want to move on swiftly to some other topics, but I'm just going to let Mr. Gordon touch on this issue briefly, because what he unpacked for us earlier would have been a legal system, a justice system that has been so out of whack because of our colonial experience, that clearly there is room for quite a bit of reform, public education as well, with respect to our legal system or justice system. Is there, and I haven't seen it, I stand corrected, I haven't really seen that touched upon to a great extent in the 10-point plan. Again, I stand corrected. But Mr. Gordon, do you think that there's space to marry those two concepts, reparations and reform of our legal systems in the Caribbean?
Definitely, I certainly share the perspectives of my fellow panelists about the value of reparation. It's not just monetary. I think reparation is a recognition that the global dichotomy of development, where we have the global south and the global north, has been based on, as Dr. De Souza said, on the extraction of the wealth and resources of, you know, countries such as those in the Caribbean for over 500 years by Europe. So we look at Europe's progress and advancement. It has not been organic. It has been artificially induced. It has been a product of them plundering and extracting all the valuable resources and the wealth of other regions of the world for over 500 years. Our underdevelopment as well is not artificially induced. It's a direct consequence of the exploitative and extractive relationship that we have had with the West for many centuries. So a part of reparation is one, accepting that you have benefited immensely from the plundering and the exploitation of the wealth of these resources. Two, accepting that you have played a very a major role in terms of the underdevelopment of these regions. Three, it's about saying then we have tremendous wealth at our disposal. We have tremendous assets at our disposal. We have invested in weaponry when it's convenient. We see where, for example, in the context of what is happening with Russia, Ukraine now, Europe has not hesitated to provide billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. Certainly, we have seen where Germany has provided similarly billions of dollars to Israel for the Holocaust. So a part of reparation is understanding that these are wealthy countries, and the fact of their wealth is based on them having exploited and extracted the wealth of others. And therefore, reparation is for them to take tangible steps in different ways, whether it be through supporting interventions in education and training, whether it be through supporting interventions in infrastructure development, whether it be through supporting medical exploration and innovation. In ways you have affected us, you're attempting to do tangible things to put us on a firm path of growth and progress, right? So I think that there's an opportunity to intertwine reparation and reform. The issue, however, is that while we can undertake reforms internally, reparation has to be a consensus between the countries of the region and those who exploited us before. So while we have activists in the region who are very strident about reparation, we're not seeing the same level of stridency from the European powers. You know, they have to meet us halfway. So while we can reform our system because we're independent territories and we have the capacities to do so, in terms of how we intertwine that with reparation, the reparation is a little bit difficult to measure because, again, we lack certain resources to undertake the transformations internally, and therefore we rely significantly, and we will rely significantly on foreign support, whether fiscal, technical, otherwise, and that is the reparation aspect of it. You know, currently as it stands, we have to pay for and with interest any support we get from the West in the form of loans, etc. We want debt forgiveness as which is an element of reparation. But again, with our reparations reforms. Reforms are things we can undertake internally to an extent. Reparation is something that must be based on mutual understanding and agreements between us and our former colonizers. And so I feel like the reparation aspect of the conversation is always likely to be slower than the reform. But I do think that there is opportunity for both to complement each other. I do think there are opportunities, right? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. And it brings me to the next aspect of this discussion I really wanted to get back into. And clearly, I think that we can all agree that the discussion about reparations is one that we will have to be in on for the long haul. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It is a process. It will take time. And in many instances, we are committed to staying the course where that's concerned. Now, Dr. De Souza, in his presentation, I keep making reference to his presentation because it was so thorough. He spoke to the Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that many of our governments and countries are being offered financing for developmental projects at terms that appear to be favorable, much more favorable perhaps than some of the other development financing that we would have seen previously. To what extent, Dr. De Souza, before we go into that, this is an interactive discussion, and we do have one question with regard to that from Tedra Kirby. She wants to know, and I do recall seeing the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. Gonzalez, in Taiwan earlier this week, enjoying himself, clearly celebrating his birthday. She wants to know whether, and obviously that comes at, I don't necessarily want to say it comes at a cost, but certainly there are implications that come along with that. And she wants to know whether St. Vincent and the Grenadines would be in any way disadvantaged by the exclusion from the Chinese initiative.
Well, as you know, because of the One China policy, governments are forced to align themselves with either China and Taiwan. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I believe it's the Saints. I believe St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, and Belize, if I remember correctly, are still among the few in the region that are still aligned to Taiwan. And so the question as to whether or not St. Vincent would be disadvantaged by being aligned to Taiwan as opposed to China with respect to the Belton Road, it really comes down to the benefits that St. Vincent is deriving from its relationship with Taiwan. We look at the history of the relationship between St. Vincent and Taiwan, and they've invested millions over the course of that relationship. They continue to do so now in terms of scholarships, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of, as St. Vincent has grown and developed, Taiwan has tried to play its part. I think the question then becomes for many, and I suspect what some people are asking is, who's going to give you more, particularly in the context of China trying to exert its global power currently. And I mentioned in my presentation just how much money has grown in terms of foreign direct investment from around 2003 to present, where it was just over $1 billion then, and now it's several $1 billion here, several $100 billion, at least 100 and something billion in terms of FDI from China and its development in terms of the Belt and Road. So the question is, are we being disadvantaged by being aligned to Taiwan? The question, it really comes down to what we see. And our Prime Minister in St. Vincent and the Grenadines has basically said, listen, you don't want to fare with friends, essentially. When you've been in this long-standing relationship with Taiwan for so long and you've benefited significantly, it certainly would seem a bit disingenuous now if you were to move to China simply because of the rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so that's how I would answer that question, really. It really depends on what St. Vincent is getting from Taiwan and the nature of the relationship. But to an extent, based on the type of projects that I see being rolled out under the Belt and Road Initiative, it could be that we're missing out, but at the same time, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been benefiting from other development partners stepping in. So if you look at the $600 million port that's now being developed, that was from a grant from the UK largely, and so they are finding other ways to develop in terms of the infrastructure, whereas other countries, and a lot of that was grant funding, and even in terms of other projects that Taiwan has done, a lot of it is grant funding as opposed to China, which does a lot of loans. And so that there, I hope that answers your question a bit.
Okay, I do want to pose another question to you, though. During your presentation, again, you spoke to the fact that because of where the Caribbean societies, Caribbean governments are placed because of this legacy of colonialism, many are not in a position to undertake the types of development projects that they would have undertaken, and that they continue, my interjection, that I think they continue to take under this Belt and Road Initiative. Mm-hmm. What is so different about the terms and conditions of these arrangements that now makes it so favorable for us to get on with this kind of infrastructural transformation under Chinese support?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the classification of many of our Caribbean countries as basically upper middle income countries. And when you graduate into that range, the rates at which you're able to borrow changes. So if you are a lower income country, the concessionary rates that you're able to access are significantly lower than those countries that are upper middle income. And so for a lot of the countries in the region that have graduated, it then becomes difficult to access this sort of concessionary finance from the IMFs and the World Banks and so on. And that's why currently there's actually a push, I think, being led by Barbados and in order to sort of rewrite this whole notion of concessionary finance and graduation to upper middle income, and then it's almost like you're being punished for development. That's basically the position that a lot of economists are putting forward. As you develop a bit, it becomes more expensive to develop, and that's what we see. So that's really the crux in terms of why it's so difficult to get the concessionary finance. So against that backdrop, where you have concessionary financing being more difficult to access or at higher rates because you've now graduated as a more developed country, now enter the Belt and Road Initiative that's offering lower rates. Yeah, it's offering lower rates. It's offering, in many instances, long-term financing, and also they've entered into some interesting financing arrangements. So you could think about the toll road situation in Jamaica, where it's different models where you're getting the infrastructure, but in innovative ways. So that's important, and I think that's really the crux of it. They're coming in at a point in time where the Caribbean countries are finding it difficult to finance in the way that they would want, at the rates at which they would want, and so the ability to do so at a cheaper rate from these Chinese entities. And not just that as well, when you think about how the Belt and Road Initiative is being rolled out, a lot of it encapsulates the construction as well. So sometimes you're not just borrowing. For example, in Guyana, they're contracting with the Chinese engineering company to come in and build the road, come in and build the electrical dam and so on. And that's important because there's an element there of not having to worry about that as well, where you're getting financing and you're getting the construction built into one almost. So I think that's sort of being part of the proliferation of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Understood. I want to take us back to our viewers, some of the questions from our viewers. Tedra Kirby, again, thank you so much for your participation. She says, Dr. Matthews, do you believe that reparatory justice will be achieved in our lifetime? And I want to add, in the meantime, do you see schemes and programs like the Belt and Road Initiative as being helpful in the meantime? You're muted. You're muted, Dr. Matthews.
Well, vision be achieved in our lifetime. Well, I mean, my first response would be no, and most people's first response would be no, but we have seen some improvements since it first started. That is the formal launch in 2013, although there were efforts long before that, even with Aristide, when, as Dr. Delano was talking about the economic dimension, what came to my mind was Aristide, former president of Haiti, asking for France to return that 1.5 million francs which they demanded from Haiti as payment in recognition of Haitian independence. Didn't come to much, but now we are seeing the University of Glasgow, which benefited significantly from slavery, making offers to the University of the West Indies through the intervention of Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. So we're seeing that movement. And I think it's quite significant that in around 2015, the United States of America has launched its branch of the reparation movement. I mean, not Caribbean, but America had its own slavery down in the South and so on. But the United States of America have joined forces with the Caribbean. And I mean, it's a bit embarrassing to say, but normally when the USA gets on a bandwagon or joins a course, there is normally some levels of progress. So I do not think that it will not happen during our lifetime. It will take some time, as most people agree. It's not a dash, it's a long distance race, but I am seeing some positive signs on the horizon. Since it had started in 2013, it has definitely taken up some momentum. And I think it will continue to gallop into taking up more momentum. As young people, we should not become discouraged, but we should join the cause, attend the conferences, do the research, write the papers to add fuel. Because to me, this is the movement for the Caribbean people. This is our age, our time to have our voice heard with regard to holding Europe accountable for hundreds of years of enslavement and the fact that they are still benefiting from that enslavement up to this day. Every Caribbean person should become involved. It will
Thank
happen.
you. And I just wanted to add on my piece to the question about schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I know that you are a historian and not an expert on development policy and whatnot, but historians, in my view, are jacks of all trades. When you look at what China continues to offer to developing countries and regions like the Caribbean, do you see aspects of those arrangements that appear to be a new form of colonialism? When you look at what happened perhaps in Sri Lanka, to what extent does this have the potential on one hand to help us get to where we want to be in the absence of things like reparations, but then on the other to steep us back into a situation of dependency?
Right, right. You're quite correct. I'm not I am a historian looking back at the past rather than at current affairs, but as historians, we need to understand that connection between the past and the present so that the possibility of China's involvement in the Caribbean and the re-emergence of a kind of dependency is something that we need to be concerned about. But I like to take a different spin on that matter. And to me, there is a lesson there, a warning there for Caribbean people to be hardworking, to be industrious. Sometimes, we are a bit lazy and we allow people from different parts of the world to come into our region and do the work that we should be doing. All right? I mean, I know financial situation could limit the extent of what we can do, and Chinese are investing and so on. But in terms of the labor dimension, I would like us to focus on that a little bit more. And we, in our own different, spaces and territories in the Caribbean, should be willing, because we are able to make a contribution, to do the work, to labor, rather than making it necessary for us to have this large importation of a foreign labor force, quite similar to perhaps indentureship or even slavery, and definitely dependency. We can take our lesson there, which is let's do the work. And that's my take on it.
Understood. Thank you so much for giving us a bit of history with a bit of economics. I want to, just because I know the discussion has overwhelmingly gone in the direction of economics, reparations, the Belt and Road Initiative, and we still do have questions in the chat about that. But I also want to ensure that we get the full scope of things. And Mr. Gordon obviously is here to talk with us about the law. So one of the questions that I wanted to pose to him is whether he believes, obviously you believe that republicanism is a step in the right direction, but do you consider it to be the final step in relation to us severing our ties from the British and obviously from the British?
I wouldn't say it's the final step. There we have the matter of the Privy Council. Certainly, I believe that Caribbean states should finalize the Privy Council as the CCG as the final court of appeal to replace the Privy Council. So I wouldn't say it's a final step, but I think it's a long overdue. This is something that should have been done from the point of independence, and the reason being, as I've outlined, there's no perceptible, there's no obvious benefit of continuing to have the Queen as head of state. I noted, for example, that the position or the office of the Governor General is financed by the taxpayers of Caribbean countries. For many Caribbean countries, including Jamaica, the UK has imposed visa restriction on us, which means that in order for us to enter the UK as immigrants, we have to obtain a British visa. In the countries of the UK is not a significant trading partner of Jamaica currently. So again, as far as I'm concerned, it is symbolic, it is purely sentimental, and it has no real value to us as a people. But it's also about reparation as well, because again, the damage that colonialism has done to us is enduring. It cuts across all fabric of Caribbean society. It's also psychological. So part of reparation is understanding that these institutions produce trauma. They were complicit in the genocide of our ancestors. They were complicit in the extraction of our resources and the abuse of our ancestors, the underdevelopment of the Caribbean, the underdevelopment of Africa. And therefore, a part of reparation is doing what is morally responsible, what is right, what we should do. And therefore, moving away from these colonial legacies is a part of accepting the moral responsibility to do the right things, to say we recognize that these institutions were created trauma for us. They were complicit in the genocides that were committed against our ancestors, and therefore we have a moral responsibility to move beyond them incrementally. But I do agree, Dr. De Souza, that we have to look at overall how our system of democracy functions. There are obvious many challenges related to a system of democracy. The two-party dominance, the concentration of powers in the hands of the executive, oftentimes the lopsided and emasculated legislature, the insufficient level of participation of citizens in the decision-making processes. So it's a part of taking a comprehensive look at how our system of democracy works and find ways to improve find ways to improve however we can. And a part of improving democracy, because democracy is about creating a system that is people-centered, that is responsive to people, that's accountable to people. And therefore, if the system does not promulgate or advance the interests of people in any shape, form, or fashion, we have to make changes. And as far as I'm concerned, which I've articulated, swearing allegiance, having the Queen as head of state, and a Queen who is represented by a Governor General locally, I feel that is not consistent with democracy, which is about representing the interests of people, you know, and for that reason, that forms a compelling basis, as far as I'm concerned, for us to begin to look at that as something we can do, as something that is symbolic to say, yes, this is about repairing the past, but also developing confidence and appointing somebody who serves the people of the Caribbean, not somebody who serves our former colonizer. We want a president or somebody who is accountable, responsive, and serves the people of the region.
Yes, thank you. Some food for thought, some firewood for the reparations, for the Republican and CCJ movement over in Jamaica. Now, we are approaching the home stretch here, and we do have some more questions from our audience, and I want to get in as many as we can. David Moore, I sincerely hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly. He asked, do we see it as possible for all of our Caribbean nations to lead themselves to become debt-free and independent? Is it probable that Caribbean nations will join forces or can join forces to assist each other to become fully sustainable? Your thoughts, Dr. De Souza?
Well, I'll be honest, that's a dream. That's a dream that we have. That's a dream that certainly I have, that we're able to lead ourselves to become debt-free. The reality is that to fund our development and to fund where we want to go as a people, it's difficult. And we lack the resources, of course, partially because of the history of colonialism, but also because we have to, in essence, we have to propel our own movement forward, and the way that is common for us to do so is to borrow. I mean, can we borrow at more favorable terms? We agitate for that every day. Can we, and just to put this in terms of, in terms of numbers, in order for us to eradicate our debt, we theoretically either have to start repaying debt at a faster rate than we are borrowing, or we have to start borrowing as we repay the debt that is already on our books. Neither of those things I see as possible, given where we are and given where we want to go. So no, I don't believe that we can get to the state of where we're debt free. And I think sometimes we forget that the US and these developed countries are also heavily indebted. It's just that the structure of the global financial system allows them to be, whereas it sort of it penalizes the smaller countries as we become indebted. If you look at, for example, the debt to GDP ratio of the US and so on, you'd be surprised to see, you'd be thinking that you're looking at a Caribbean country, for example. The point I'm making is that I don't see it as a possibility for us to become debt free. I think what we can do is strive for greater cooperation to reduce the rate at which we borrow. Of course, to keep our foreign reserves as high as possible, and to do so, we have to invest in things such as our food system in the Caribbean to avoid and to reduce. Of course, CARICOM currently has the 25% planted to reduce our imports of food, because food security is important, and we have to recognize that coming together allows us to achieve some of these goals. Even if we look in terms of funding our development from a financial perspective, I am one of those who believes that the capital in the Caribbean is really operating in silos in many respects. And of course, now we only see a little bit of liberalization because of investments moving from Trinidad and Jamaica and so on. But I believe we need to reform our system to allow a company in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to easily access capital and financing from persons in Jamaica who are looking for investment opportunities. We see it in terms of the Jamaica Stock Exchange, what it's doing to empower small businesses to grow. We obviously have gone about in the Caribbean, which I believe has been a mistake in terms of each Caribbean country or several Caribbean countries having their own stock exchanges. So, for example, the Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange, the Barbados Stock Exchange, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica Stock Exchanges. And really, if we had a single CARICOM Stock Exchange, then capital would be, in my mind, flow easily between countries, which can help us develop, because that's a problem that we have now. We also have the twin problem of banks essentially hoarding our resources, where we are putting our money into the banks, but the banks are very hesitant to lend to small business and to fund our development. The banks now are interested in buying government paper or international paper from the US government. They are interested in heavily collateralized lending, such as cars. Easy now to get a car loan for almost anything. That's the type of lending that banks want to do now. They want to give you mortgages, but of course heavily collateralized, because if you don't pay, they take your house. And so that's the sort of lending we're seeing, but we're not seeing productive lending. I think the Prime Minister Barbados recently spoke to the fact that the deposit to lending ratio in the Caribbean is significantly lower than more developed countries. I think it's at 55% in Barbados, for example, where you're taking all this money from people in the form of savings, but you're not lending it back for productive usage. Whereas in the US and so, the loan to deposit ratio in terms of what those countries are lending is something like 80%, which means the capital is finding its way towards industry and to the private sector. And until we're able to achieve something like that in the region, it's going to be difficult. But the point I'm making is that by coming together, we can get there fast and we can be more efficient in doing so.
Understood. This from Tedra Kirby. Dr. Matthews, the call for reparations seems to be concentrated in certain circles. How can we ensure that this call is one that is understood and echoed by all within our Caribbean societies?
Yes, that is
I think you're muted.
right. I'm agreeing with Tedra that her observation is a valid one. Especially when I went to a conference in Antigua in 2015, it was noted that, yes, you have the national commissions for reparation of each nation present at conferences and intellectualized, but it does not trickle down to the common people. Initiatives were made, suggestions were made to widen the discourse, to widen the campaign, to get more people involved. Some suggestions included having competitions, essay writing competition, poetry compositions for school children to make them aware of the movement, to make them interested in the movement. Calypso competitions that also speak on the reparation theme. So I believe that the leaders in each of the different nation states, the 15-member states of CARICOM who are involved in the reparation movement, are aware of the need to market and to promote the reparation movement so that it does not remain within the ivory towers of intellectuals, but that it trickle down to the people. And some efforts have been made, perhaps more need to be made, but as I said, there is an awareness and some efforts have been made to widen that awareness about the reparation movement.
Understood. And I'm going to throw this same question to Mr. Gordon, but in relation to the democratization of our discussions around judicial reform and reform of our legal systems. How do we ensure that all people in Jamaica see these issues as important as the persons, the intellectuals at Mona? How do we ensure that all Jamaicans, all Antiguans see this as an important discussion?
Yeah, I think the challenge we face is that I think people are more likely to prioritize what they consider to be their more material, their more immediate needs. So while the intellectuals may very well be committed to reforms and reparations, within the country of the Caribbean, where there is a higher level of, there are challenges, economic challenges related to employment levels, related to income levels, related to the quality of infrastructure. These are day-to-day issues that Caribbean nationals grapple with, and especially within the context of the pandemic, these issues have been compounded. I think it's difficult to get people to commit or engage the more ideological issues over the realistic or the exigent issues that they face on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, when you talk to people and you ask them, what are the issues that matter to you? They will tell you that economy, security, healthcare, education. Few Caribbean nationals will tell you that reforms and reparation is big. It's a big item on their agenda because, again, these people are struggling to survive. They're struggling to make it from day to day. They're not sure where the next meal is coming from. They're talking about the low income levels. They're talking about the high standard of living. It's difficult in this kind of macroeconomic context to get Caribbean nationals to prioritize reforms. Another dimension is that we have a kind of adversarial political culture where you find that the positions that many Caribbean nationals adopt on issues is based on their political affiliation or their political loyalty or support. And therefore, many of them don't give themselves don't give themselves the opportunity to fully engage or understand many of these debates and issues. They take a partisan position rather than an objective or informed position based on research or understanding. So again, we've seen in instances such as Grenada, Antigua, and I think St. Vincent and the Grenadine, where we had referenda were held, and many of the proposals were rejected by voters, which tells us the kind of struggles that we're likely to face in terms of getting the buy-in and the support for many of the reforms. So while we as intellectuals do understand the necessity and we can articulate the necessity among ourselves, how do we convince people that these issues are worth prioritizing relative to the daily bread and butter issues that they see as being important to the quality of your life? And a part of the issue, however, is that also citizens simply don't trust politicians. They don't trust intellectuals. They feel that the intellectuals who have governed the Caribbean states since independence, they are no different from those who were before. They have plundered, they have misused, they have extracted, they have been nepotistic, they have been corrupt. There's very little trust in the political directorate. So the kind of support and buy-in that the citizens are not inclined to give that support and buy-in to politicians and intellectual, because they also believe that the intellectuals and the politicians and all of these individuals are part of the underdevelopment. They're just a different type of colonizer. So again, those are some of the things that will kind of prevent us from having a national or consensus on some of these reform-related issues that we are talking about now.
Thank you so much. And on that note, we are just about out of time. But just as we close off our discussion about the legacy of slavery, of colonization on the region and the way forward, I just want to ask each of you to leave us with a message about the area of expertise that you would have come to contribute on, starting with Delano De Souza, whether that be for our people, a message to our governments. Your closing words.
Well, I mean, in the spirit of moving forward in terms of development, I think the message I will leave is that we need to agitate as people for change, and I think we need to hold our politicians accountable. I mean, Damion just spoke about the need for reform and the lack of trust between the people and the electorate, and so the people and the political directorate. And that's important, and I think that sort of transcends almost every aspect in terms of where we are now and where we want to go. Unless we're able to elect leaders who are right and who are a right fit for the direction that we want to go as a people, then I don't see how we move forward. We have a challenge now in terms of the political system and the need for reform and all of that. But at the end of the day, if we don't hold our politicians accountable, then we're not going to achieve those sort of reforms that we want. We want to move to the CCJ. We want to have a reduction in terms of political corruption, in terms of nepotism, in terms of cronyism, in terms of all those things that stymie our development. But unless we're able to hold our politicians accountable, then we're not going to get there. And our politicians themselves need to start to take inward looks and realize that the world is changing. And we no longer have room for prime ministers being in office for 20, 30 years, almost ruling as despots and so on. Those periods in my mind have long passed. And until they're able to sort of embrace these changes, it's important that they do. Because if you think about it, and that's why I was talking to somebody the other day, one of my colleagues, and they said, listen, if I were to go into office, it would be for 1 year. And because I know that I have an expiration date in terms of my time in office, I am not going to be focused in terms of re-election. I'm going to be focused in terms of making change and impacting the lives of the people positively. And I think that's the sort of direction we want to go. When we look at it as a sort of relay, I come in as a politician, I do my due, and I leave. I'm not concerned about cementing another term or another 2 or 3 terms. And so I'm kind of holding back the development of the people because I want them to be dependent on me and my political party. Until we move to those sort of thinking in terms of our politicians, in terms of our people, I don't see how we're going to go much further than we are now.
All right. I think your microphone was muted, Kareem. So I'm just going to assume what you would have asked me to.
Yes, your closing thoughts.
Yes. I grew up hearing about leaders of the 1980s or the 1970s. You'd have heard about, for example, in the context of Jamaica, I've heard about Michael Manley and how he actively attempted to decolonize the Jamaican society. He actively attempted to transfer the balance of power from the haves to the have-not. He was a very progressive person. He was thinking about what were the things that were holding Jamaicans back. He was thinking about the structures of inequalities within the Jamaican societies. And he was taking very bold and tangible steps to equalize the Jamaican society, right? Investment in adult literacy. Investment in local agricultural production, investment in healthcare, So you look at the needs of the masses, the people, and take account of what are the investments that are required to empower people, to transform people's life. I feel that our greatest failure, at the source of our underdevelopment and our slow rate of progress, has a lot to do with just politicians who have not been visionary, they have not been progressive, they have not been forward thinking. It's a high level of cowardice. I feel that the leaders weren't able to assert themselves politically. They seem to not be committed to anything per se that is sustained. So leadership has a lot to do with it, because I feel like in the context of the Caribbean, people look up to leaders, we revere leaders, and we take direction from our leaders. We're very leader centric, and leaders for the most part have been divisive. They've majored, they've majored in minor in terms of the legislative agenda, the legislative work that needs to be done. I don't think MPs, senators understand their duties as, lawmakers. They go to the parliament and they make a lot of noise and the politicking, and they when they're there, because for the most part, many of them are absent. So we have leaders who don't take the business of leadership. We have lawmakers who don't take the business of lawmaking seriously. We have too many people appointed on the basis of nepotism, political affiliation. There are too many shortcutting where, people like myself and Dr. De Souza and others who are have something of value to contribute. We don't get opportunity to do so because of the corrupt nature of our system, where there's little accountability, there's inadequate meritocracy. I think that we have to establish a system of governance that is effective, that is based upon those principles that make governance work effectively. And I think that we have to find that. I think that is for me one of the biggest issues that is holding the Caribbean back. Or we administer our system of governance, principles upon which we govern. I think that we perhaps need to improve in that area. That's a critical factor that is underpinning our slow rate of progress and development. So I do share Dr. De Souza's observation where that is concerned.
Thank you. And Dr. Matthews, your final thoughts.
Yes, I want to end on the note that with regards to the reparation movement, in recent times, I have been very encouraged by the efficacy, by the potential of this reparation movement, especially in terms of the attitude and the response of the local people during that 2021-2022 visit of the royals to the Caribbean. These people stood up to the royals and let them realize that colonialism gone, that reparation time are come, that it is time for you to say that you are sorry. The people are involved, they catching the fire. And I think that this will bear much fruit in the not too distant future. I know people are thinking that this is not going to happen in my lifetime, but the behavior of the people, the way they change the agenda, the way they change the conversation of Prince William and his wife Kate and Sophie and Prince Charles coming to the Caribbean in this 21st century and expecting Caribbean people to bow down like they did in 1950s, in the pre-colonial, in the pre-independence period, and not admire them for their tiara and for their clothing and for their wealth and so on. Those days are gone. And Caribbean people made me proud by the way they stood up and the way in which reparation fed this new, this mature, this anti-colonial response of the people. I would encourage governments to take note of the way the people are responding and encourage that and feed it. And before long, before we even believe it can happen, we are going to see the fruits of reparation in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much. And that is as good a place as any to conclude this discussion on the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean society. reimagining emancipation. Of course, the hope is that many of the discussions that we have about these burning issues will translate to positive political outcomes and social outcomes and economic outcomes in our societies in which we share so many, common characteristics and history and culture and economics. I want to say a very special thank you to our panelists, Mr. Damion Gordon, Dr. Delano De Souza, Dr. Jillian Matthews. Thank you so much for your insightful thoughts and for being so willing to share them with us. And our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and especially to those who shared thoughts and those who asked questions. On behalf of Island Space, Caribbean, and a rich culture, thank you so much for joining us and have a good evening.
Thank you.